Sénégal bu ñëpp di naw doomu Sénégal bu ñëpp ràññee ci def lu baax ak li ñu jëriñ.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tshegofatso Mudubu, and I work for the Government Communication and Information System, and I will be the moderator for this panel today. And the panel is entitled Celebrating 30 Years of Media Freedom, What's Next for the Future? And joining me, panel members, and to my far right is Sandile Nene, and he's also from Government Communication and Information System. He's worked around issues of media policy, and currently now is looking at modeling and issues of sustainability in the sector. And Tandy Smith, I think you're all very familiar with her. She's from the MMA, and she leads a lot of the programs led by the MMA. And then to my left is Professor Mantla Khatebe from the University of Johannesburg, and he's recently completed a book on public sector communication in the digital age. So I think he'll also give us a lot of insights about where to in terms of the future. And then we've got Letabo Dibezo, former MMA, current Media Development Diversity Agency, where he's employed, and he will share a lot of insights around community media. We thought that it's important that as we put this panel together, and we reflect, we do it collectively as, academia, civil society, and government, so that we're able to have this conversation that is comprehensive about where is our sector going to go. So we'll look at highlights, we'll look at challenges, we'll look at future prospects as well. So I'm going to start with you, Sandile, with your opening statement around, those highlights, those challenges, and what we could look for, towards in the future as we explore in this conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Seko. I thought maybe to start, I do want to declare up front that whatever I say, it should be taken in within the context that I still work under supervision.
Recording in progress.
So I've got two of my board members who are from the MEC Charter Council, and there are few colleagues that I have worked with. But maybe to start, I think let's celebrate the mass media in its totality. I think we do come a long way. We do know that the influence that our sector has had in our private and social life is immense. If you look at our social routines, all of them are actually influenced by the media. If you want to, let's talk, for instance, around issues of courtship. Largely, they're driven by media because people meet in cinemas. As you drive in the morning towards your day-to-day activities, you wake up to news. As you are driving along the side of the road, somebody is trying to sell you something in terms of the billboard, the outdoor media sector, until you get to your destination. So we are celebrating, colleagues, the massive investment that was made by different entrepreneurs, celebrating that in the print media, for instance, we've got over 160 years of delivery since the first newspaper called the commercial newspaper. Ironically, because I come from Maritzburg, Prof, the only surviving newspaper for now in terms of the oldest ones is the Natal Witness. We have entered a period which is quite nice, towards more than 100 years of broadcasting, 30 years of community and commercial sector in terms of the broadcasting. And of course, my colleague MDDA will talk about their 20 years of the fund manager being the MDDA. But beside that, what we appreciate from the side of government is that we rely on content distributing platforms to ensure that the information reaches our citizens. Without the support, without the existence of media, we would not be able to achieve the constitutional obligation around, media freedom and the ability to impart and receive information. So that's where I'd really start. Of course, there are challenges that we are facing, both in terms of what does sustainability of media mean to us, and what are the issues that we need to take forward as we are saying 30 years between now. What we are witnessing right now is almost the unbundling of the sector on its own, because we are facing challenges that we've never faced before, where even the telcos are now fintech, they are also now media distributing platform, contributing and obviously competing with all of us. And then again, the almost collapse of the foundations of the media, which is the advertising revenue, is giving us headaches. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandile, for that. And then moving to you, Prof, thinking about the reflections Sandile has made, in terms of the study that you've just done and studies that you've done previously, but also as a practitioner, who has worked in public sector communication, what are your reflections around 30 years, of media freedom, but also of treating information as a public good and using media as a platform to convey that?
Thank you very much, Tsecho, for that, and good morning, everyone. I come from the academy, so we have to be a bit critical about the role of the media, especially when you look at its achievements over the past 30 years. I think the first point we need to acknowledge is the fact that this media freedom we're celebrating today is 30 years, did not come cheap. We have to acknowledge the role of media activists such as the likes of Zolake Sisulu, Pesi Qoboza, Agri-Cluster, and many of those who played a critical role. Actually, they risked their lives for us to be having this media freedom that we have today. However, post-1994, what happened with this media is that it reconfigured along liberal lines. And what that means is therefore that it creates dichotomies within society based on the role that the media must play in democracy. I think for me that's the first point that we must therefore acknowledge. And if you look at the commercialized media in particular and its location in society, it is caught in these realities. I mean, there are quite a number of issues that I think that the media should have played a more active and critical role in being on the side of the people. But what the media does, is, because of its location, those structures forces the media to play a particular role. Let me just make two examples. The discourse on land expropriation. The media played a critical role in dismissing that discourse as a reckless discourse, as a discourse that was going to chase investors, as a discourse that was going to lend South Africa to another failed state like Zimbabwe, without locating those issues of the people who are dispossessed, who are landless, and who are marginalized. So, and precisely because of its location, therefore you have those cleavages in society that the media sometimes is unable to be on the side of the people, its media freedom notwithstanding. And what then has happened is that with the introduction of digital platforms, which are compromising the very important role of independent journalism. I mean, you saw that emerging in the inquiry. Is that the book that you are referring to is the book that there are quite a number of critical authors that have participated in it's an edited volume. You've got the views that are shared by someone like Themba Masego, who talks from the ethical point of view, because the ethics is a sort of a double-edged sword. You have a role of public communicators who have to be ethical in what they do, but also you've got the ethic perspective from the media, the mass media, the commercialized media in particular. But what is emerging is that there is a huge dependency on digital platforms especially from the public sector point of view, for them to be able to drive their messages and to drive a communication. But of course, and we need to separate that from the role of the platform companies, the big tech in particular, who are playing, in my view, a very destructive role in robbing us of quality journalism. I mean, we see a number of titles are closing down and digitization is playing quite a huge role in those issues. So yes, we're celebrating a huge achievements on media freedom, but of course there are these challenges that we should not shy away in dealing with them.
Thank you for those thought-provoking inputs, and I trust that they'll make the conversation even more interesting as we go into it. Just moving to you, Thandi, I mean, in terms of, advocacy role and the role that civil society does to keep, the rights of media and journalists at the forefront, for them to be able to operate freely and fairly. If you look at South Africa in the past 30 years, what are the strides that we've made, but what are the challenges as well, as you give us your opening statement?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think just a disclaimer, you'll see on the program that William Bird was supposed to be on the panel. I'm not William. Hopefully a slightly upgraded version. But yeah, and what a great discussion to be having, reflecting on 30 years. And I think, we can't be talking about the wins and the good things that we've seen around media and media freedom over the last 30 years without acknowledging the challenges as well. But I think from MMA civil society perspective, our work with the media over the last 30 years, so we began as an organization, as a project in 93 in the lead up to the 1994 elections. And so, we've sort of walked this journey of contributing, promoting and advancing media freedom over the period. And it's been really interesting, reflecting. We've seen how media have come from a sort of place in the early 90s where, for example, looking at the quality of coverage, and I want to bring in issues around gender and gender-based violence and how the media grappled with those narratives in the 90s compared to now. One of the examples that we look at was a horrific story with headlines in the news in the 90s about a home invasion where the story was centered around how the husband in the story had to suffer and watch his wife being violated and raped. And the story was around him and him as the victim, and how we've moved from that into how we portray gender-based violence in the media. And I think that in itself, in terms of narratives, is a win. We also look at how the media have covered elections over the last 30 years. And aside from the challenges and the issues around media coverage, we see an overwhelmingly fair and positive adherence to compliance and regulations during an election period. I think that needs to be recognized. Just going back to the coverage around gender and gender-based violence, even though we see wins in that space, we're still dealing with power, unbalanced power dynamics in media, and the completely overwhelmingly overrepresentation of male voices in the media. So it's interesting. We have these wins, and we recognize how media have advanced over the years, but we still deal with these imbalances in these narratives and power dynamics and representation. I think just another area that I wanted to touch on in the sort of opening remarks is around how we have, over the last 30 years, made some really big wins with upholding media freedom principles in our sort of policy and litigation areas. I think we've seen how the judiciary has played their part in promoting and upholding media freedom. We saw a few years ago a precedent-setting case in the Van Breda murder case, where prior to the case, the default was that media did not have access to criminal courts, criminal proceedings, unless it was then approved by the judge. So you had to apply to have media access. That has now been changed for the default to have open access, unless otherwise stated that it needs to be closed for whatever reason. And so we've made, I mean, that's just one example of some of the sort of wins. But, you know, on the other side of that, we've seen over the last few years an increase in what's called slap suit cases, the strategic litigation against public participation. We've seen some really prominent cases where these techniques have been used to silence journalists and to, you know, clamp down on media freedom. And so we need to be looking at reform around how we protect journalists, protect media freedom in light of slap suit litigation. We've also seen, you know, some great wins in terms of regulatory mechanisms. We have the Press Council, self and co-regulatory mechanisms in terms of how we operate within the media sphere. We have we set up the SANEF, South African National Editors Forum, the BCCSA. So we have, you know, really good self and co-regulatory mechanisms. But then again, on the flip side of that, we've seen really heavy clampdown and attempts to stifle media freedom. We've seen one of the latest issues is around, you know, the vetting of journalists at the SABC. Most recently, head of news with just prior to elections, vetting and attempts at polygraph testing. So, you know, we've made significant strides in many areas and really doing, you know, really well in upholding the constitutional principles of media freedom. And we've seen many instances and examples, but we're grappling with real big challenges and attempts to do the opposite as well.
Thank you. You've highlighted a lot of opportunities as well, and I think this is where kind of this panel, you know, representing the different sectors can actually come together and look at issues of converging on a common narrative about what needs to be revised to make the industry more conducive, I suppose, for everyone. Letabo, to you, and going into the community media sector, I think we've had reflections about, you know, in the public sector, in the commercial sector. If we can just zoom into this 20 years of like fund managing and really dealing with grassroots community media development, what is that experience like, and what are the challenges, you know, looking at the past 20 years of the MDDA and the work and the mandate that it's supposed to do?
Sure, thank you. I think maybe let me just start off where Thandi left off, around recognizing the role of civil society in litigating in the interest of safeguarding press freedom and freedom of expression. I mean, when I was at MMA, our daily fight was against the Protection of State Information Bill. And if it wasn't for civil society, I think we would have been in a very bad situation. I think also civil society's continuous role in ensuring that institutions that are supposed to ensure accountability actually do their work. I think if it wasn't for civil society, I think South Africa would be in a very precarious situation. Recognizing the 20 years of MDDA, I think, I mean, for us, is the continuous support from the commercial broadcasters through the USAV levy. I think if it wasn't for that continuous support, I think the community media sector would be non-existent. In the past 20 years, we've supported the community media sector with non-financial support that is estimated at around 20 million plus, and financial support, we're looking at around 600 million plus. And the number of direct and indirect jobs that we have also created through supporting community media sector. And I think through the MDDA as well, we have the support from the MDDA. We've seen a lot of community media organizations that have come up with innovative ways to support themselves or sustain themselves outside the government grant. which is a good thing because it allows us to then reach those other organizations that are unable to reach. In instances where we have excess funds, we've also supported organizations that with governance training. I think governance is a critical thing for the community media sector, and it enables then communities to have alternative media platforms. I think another highlight for me, and also depending on which side of the politics you are on, is the inquiry into the SABC board's fitness to hold office. I think we are celebrating a qualified audit for the SABC because of that process. If it wasn't, I mean, I think for the first time we saw the ANC caucus rally behind this process, which for me was a first, and maybe Sandile can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, the inquiry set the scene for boards that basically take the fight to political principles, which is something that we did not see before. So I think those are the major highlights for me. The lowlights is the economic challenges that the media sector broadly is facing, and particularly the print sector. And that also has direct implications for the sustainability of the MDDA and also community media. The shrinking advertising spend means that a majority of community media organizations do not have access to advertising funding. The challenge also the competition by digital platforms as well is taking away revenue from the community media sector, which means that as an organization we need to really knock on different doors to sustain the community media sector. And lastly, the issue of gender diversity. I think we have seen an increase in cyber misogyny in the media. I was taking a look at some of the stats from MMA's elections research, and there's an increased attack on female journalists, which poses a challenge for us, and also the issue gender diversity in terms of management and ownership of these media institutions as well, even in the community media sector, poses a challenge for us. So, and I think going into the future, those are critical areas that we need to look into.
Thank you for that. Thank you, all of you, for your thought-provoking opening statements. What I'm getting as a common theme across the board is that there's some level of transformation that has to occur across the sector, whether it's the public communication sector, and I like what Prof brought in about the issue of ethics, that ethics are a double-edged sword. Public sector communicators must be ethical, journalists must be ethical, you know? So where do we find the middle ground in terms of ensuring that we make these ethical considerations? Because we do need to deliver this freedom of expression across the board. And that the media, if they are backed up by powerful institutions that finance them, are not the only ones that then stand on the side of morality. And then others are then criticized as being unethical. So I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, now that you are looking at me, let me marry this question you're raising on ethics to the transformation point that you touched on earlier on. Because for me, it is important. I mean, there was a study that was done by Maiden Guardian in 2019 on media transformation. That revealed that the media ownership structure and demographics, as well as the funding model, showed that there was very little transformation that was happening in the media in South Africa. Now, for me, that is very important to talk about ethics, because ethics is not about holding the government to account or not doing the wrong things, but it's also about doing what is right. And transformation is one of those ethical questions that we must talk about. Because what then happens is that when you then don't deal with transformation of the management structures in the newsrooms, of the ownership patterns of the media, you then get a skewed view of what is happening in society. Because the underprivileged and the marginalized citizens then do not have a chance to get their side of a story represented in, especially in the commercialized media. That is why then from the civic society perspective, which is also not monolithic, is that you then get various groupings that will use different forms of communicative power, whether you agree with them or not. But they find different ways. You find organizations such as Abahlali Basemjondolo, for example, banning tires as a form of communication, because they will tell you that their views are not represented and they cannot express themselves through the media. And that's an ethical question that we must deal with from the communication point of view. You'll find a problematic organization, right, in my view, very problematic, like Operation Dudula, finding different ways of expressing their views, because they will tell you that the issues that they raise as the marginalized people, their views are not represented in the mainstream discourse that is happening. In my view, we cannot separate the transformation question to the ethical question.
Okay. Thank you. Tandy?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add on to that a bit and to say, you know, I think the issue of ethics or the ethical question, I mean, we know it's such a grey, difficult area to grapple with. But in terms of media and how media operates, you know, for mainstream news media, we have the Press Council, and we've got the Press Council code, and we have news media bodies who subscribe to the Press Council and follow the code. And in terms of reporting, in terms of content, in terms of sort of operations, you know, adhering to that code is what shapes ethical reporting, at least. Ownership issues, yes, are a challenge, and you know, transformation issues is one that we always comes up in these conversations. You know, and if we want to talk about, I think that's a whole other sphere of conversation. But if you want to look at, you know, transformation of ownership, you need to start grappling with all the corporate structures of media. One of the big threats to that kind of model as at the moment, and yes, it's sort of moving away from news media, but looking at media sector, is the current merger between Canal Plus and MultiChoice, where we've got a foreign-owned entity coming in to buy out one of our biggest broadcasters on the continent. So, you know, we yes, they're kind of like local level issues around transformation, but they're really big challenges. And, you know, what is that going to mean for community media sector where MultiChoice carries most of those platforms and most of those channels? You know, so when we talk about transformation and media ownership, we're heading for a really massive battle ahead of us, I think, in that area. But yeah, I think the issue of ethics comes back down to, you know, at where do we hold media accountable to ethics? And we have the press code to help us navigate that. But I don't think we can have that conversation without looking at our online space. Prof, you brought in the issue of how, you know, entities like Operation Dudula communicate. So I think, you know, when we're talking about communication spheres and those channels of communication, our online space is where we need to be focusing a lot of that attention as well.
So you've brought in the conversation, I think, now around regulation, but also the effects of globalization in terms of the media ecosystem as a totality. So Sandile, I want to move to you to say, in the 30 years, you know, has South Africa done well in terms of global standards in ensuring that legislative reform is at a standard that can make us compete globally, and that we can safeguard what we have as a country, for example. If the sector is worried about this co-ownership, between Canal and the multi-choice group, what does that mean? Can we have legislation that will ensure that all the hard work that civil society has done, that the state has done, that academia has done to ensure that the media sector in this country is to somewhat at a level of sustainability, but freedoms are guaranteed? What strides have we made?
Okay, thank you for the question. Maybe when we get to the office, we'll have to check, because I've noted that most of the difficult questions are directed to me. I don't know why. Maybe as a start, I think I like what Prof. as well as Thandi are raising. So around the ethical question, there are things that we shouldn't really be regulating. There are things that we know that from a transformation perspective, it's the right thing to do. The minute you start doing regulation, really it should tell you that there's a market failure. But the other elements that I think the media must do well on is around how we profile young people in media. It's a bit and pieces, but if you look at, by and large, young people are not really well represented in media. When they are, it's because maybe they are protesting somewhere, so it's very negative. But then if you ask the question, maybe to answer it directly, I think we do have the governing legislative reform in the form of the Electronic Communications Act. It does indicate, for instance, that the foreign ownership of a South African media is limited to 20%. Now, if you then are looking at the issue around multi-choice and Canal Plus, obviously there's also a section that says on the good cause shown, it would also include things like going to Parliament to advocate for that. So that it's a, I don't know how they, but obviously we'll also have to check with the ICASA, because if you had to look at currently, they are over that limit, which is set in law. Then the question that you've asked, whether or not I think we've done quite well, but at some point, I'll be the first one to say we dropped the ball. We know that we have a press code, and in the Electronic Communications Act, for members of the press code, if you're still a member of the press code, you'll be exempted. So if not, then you need to be subjected to pre-classification of your media outlet to the FPB. Without naming names, there are organizations in the print media which have left the Press Council, but they've not gone in terms of the law to FPB for pre-classification of their newspapers every day that they publish. So what we are finding is that on paper we are good, but I think the issue is about enforcement of the things that we have. And of course, we still lack quite a bit in terms of the other areas of transformation. Just on the point that Prof raised, there was a Print and Digital Media of South Africa report, which released, the structure that released the state of transformation in 2016. And what was very funny is that immediately when the report was released, and it found that the media, particularly the print, had not been transformed to the desired levels, the structure was disbanded. Of course, in government right now, we are working with the print and digital media sector to ensure that at least we bring back the conversation about transformation and revitalization of the sector. Thanks.
Maybe I can
Yes,
just come
you
in
may
there.
go ahead,
I think
Yutab.
the issue of ethics is critical to media playing its watchdog role. And I think from the perspective of community media, it's also a critical element for professionalizing the community media sector. One of the challenges that we've had is that the 200 plus community media publications with that we support, a small fraction of them adhere to the Press Council or are members of the Press Council. And one of the things that we have done is that in order for you to be considered as a grantee, if you are a publisher, is that you then need to be a member of the Press Council for the duration of your grant. And we would then also pay for your membership for the Press Council. But coming to issues of regulation, I think there's a need for proactive regulation in the country. To deal with issues of platform accountability, for one, to deal with issues of competition in cases of mergers or acquisitions like the one between Canal and MultiChoice, and which for us gives us a headache because MultiChoice is one of the biggest contributors to the USAF levy, and should that thing fall through, it would be interesting to see if MultiChoice would still be a contributor to on the USAF levy and what that means for the sustainability of the community media sector.
Tandy, yeah.
The
conversation must flow.
I don't think we can be talking about regulation without sort of acknowledging the elephant in the room when it comes to regulation of the sector, and that is that we're still dealing and enforcing regulations and policies that were drafted 2 decades ago. We're sitting with the audiovisual white paper on audiovisual content services that has been, in process for 4 years now, and we're not seeing the finalization of the processes. And amongst that, we're seeing introductions of bills like the SABC bill that are grossly unconstitutional, and will do more damage to the sector than not. And I think you asked a question, or you posed a question around South Africa's kind of position in the global space. There's so many countries around the world that are grappling with how to manage regulation of the new, or not new anymore, but the sort of digital environment, and South Africa could be leading that space, but we're so hindered by political interests and agendas and roadblocks in our policy development. I mean, it took we started talking about DTT, digital terrestrial television, and regulations in 2008, and we never finalized that process, and now it's pretty much too late. We almost completely missed a massive kind of chunk in the digital transformation of the sector because of political and commercial interests. And so, we have the expertise. We have the kind of I think to hesitant, we have the will in terms of the sector wanting to be a global leader in how we navigate this. We've got the opportunity to develop multi-stakeholder independent approaches to kind of regulation and navigating the space. But I think we can't not acknowledge the fact that we are so politicized in how we go about these processes that it's a complete hindrance into actually progressing to where we could be.
So, I mean, there's the upcoming review of the MDDA bill. There's the SABC bill. It seems like, then the audiovisual white paper, it seems like in this 30 years, like today, like in 2024, 17th of October, there's a recognition that we need to ensure that whatever new laws that we're going to put into place or whatever amendments we're going to make, they have to be futuristic. And they have to include all the observations, I think, that you've made and that have been made, I think, since the conversations on Tuesday. And all the proposals should really make it into those public hearings. And I think that the time is now. So I think we've had enough time to talk amongst ourselves with the audience listening. We'd like to take a couple of questions. So, Prof. Haba, may go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I want to address myself to our colleagues from GCIS. You know, we spend an enormous amount of time as civil society. We've heard praise for the role of civil society and the judiciary in particular, and I think it's absolutely true, in defending, in having to defend media freedom in this country. We spend an enormous amount of time dealing with atrocious communication bills before Parliament. SABC bill is cited. The secrecy bill is coming back to Parliament. We know the laws that when the hate speech bill was first tabled, it was terrible. It was absolutely appalling. So we spend an enormous amount of energy having to try and work with Parliament to try and knock those bills into something that supports media freedom and doesn't attack it. And at the same time, we're hearing about a number of very pertinent current issues affecting media freedom. Slap cases, the harassment of women in particular online, the harassment of journalists in the field, often by police. These are immediate and pressing issues. I want to ask you, and let me say that my impression is that GCIS is passive in response to that. If I'm wrong, please tell me. What I'm asking, my question is there a more positive role for GCIS to play in promoting, supporting actively the defense of media freedom to get us off this defensive mode that we have to defend ourselves against government encroachment on it a lot of the time?
Thanks for that, Prof. Haba. Before we get to any response, another question?
Thank you. My name is Dimitri Martinez. If it's okay, I'll sit, not in the way of other people. There were a couple of issues. I think maybe the regulation one really got me thinking. I never thought I would hear some of my colleagues in government advocating for maybe less regulation, and it's very encouraging to hear. The fact of the matter is, without regulation, we wouldn't have the hundreds of community radio stations. We wouldn't have the amount of local content on our screens. But what we don't have is competition. We have a handful of commercial radio companies. We have one free-to-air commercial TV channel. We have one pay TV operator, which, as has been mentioned, may be in the hands of a foreign company. So the issue of ownership, diversity of ownership, and certainly I heard my colleague from MDDA speaking about community media, but my understanding is that the mandate is also for small commercial media. Perhaps there's something, are there any still around? Are they still viable? Then in terms of the issue of regulation, and it addresses, or it's addressed by the policy vacuum, where we have mandates of different state entities confused. We have the Film and Publications Board, which is a classification board, referred to as a content regulator. There again, I think there are 3 elephants in the rooms, actually, Thandi. That was the second one. And then finally, I think the issue, having heard, it is encouraging that, we speak about all the different platforms that can carry the voice of government and the message of government to citizens. But what are the platforms for citizens to be heard by government? That's why I speak about the small and the community media. That's certainly one platform that's not in the noise of the social media platforms. So A couple of comments and maybe 2 questions. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Dimitri. Any other question before we respond? Okay, we'll take the responses. Oh, there is one more question. Apologies.
My name is Ezekiel Kekano from the Helen Suzman Foundation. I have a question for Prof. He said that the media was found not to be on the side of the people. So I want to ask Prof, is it the role of the media to be on the side of the people, or the media's role is to report the truth? And what does be on the side of the people mean? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, should we start with you, Prof? I think. Okay, Tandi will contribute as well.
More than happy to do that. I suppose it's the ideological question of the role of the media in democracy. And perhaps the question is, what is the role of the media in democracy? Is to tell the truth. Fully agree with that. But whose truth is also a question. Where you go, I mean, if you can go where I come from, people will tell you that their biggest issues is a question of land. There's been quite a number of books that have been written about the land and people wanting the land. And the media has got a responsibility to tell the truth, that the majority of South Africans, they want the land. And therefore the media should not tell us the voices and the views of the elites who are sitting in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. That's all I'm saying. It must tell you the truth of the people. If you look at, let me exemplify this thing. If you look at how the media covered the question of, let me talk about online media, online commercialized media, how it covered the issue of the land expropriation from the voices that were prioritized there as sources of news, and the people who wrote about it, who were given platforms in that media, were not the ordinary people. It was the people who had the interest of defending the status quo. That's my argument, that's my view. We can differ with it, but I am arguing that the media must tell the voice of, must be the mouthpiece. Not the mouthpiece, but it must be the mirror of our society. It should not be a mirror of a section of society. That's all I am saying. And this happens across all discourses, whether we look at the nationalization discourse, whether you agree with it or not, who talks about it, whether it's the SABC, whether, I mean, look at the coverage of the media on the war in Ukraine. It is very clear that the South African media takes the views of the Western media as they are and repeats them. There is a trend that if you read South Africa's online media, for example, they'll take what CNN is reporting, they'll take what BBC is reporting and repeat it as a view. I'm not saying CNN and BBC are wrong, but surely there are other perspectives globally that we should be knowing about. You listen to SABC, then they say so and so from BBC reports. So, you know, that's all I'm saying. Whether it's wrong or right, we can debate about it and we can make our views. I think Professor Harbour is asking a very interesting question for my colleagues at GCIS. I don't think they've got, because for me, I think it's a very important question, but I think I would love to see the role of the Portfolio Committee in communication playing exactly that role. In ensuring that it is not the responsibility of the civil society, it's not a burden of the civil society, but you need an activist portfolio committee that is on the side of civil society in defending media freedoms. But I'm not speaking on behalf of GCIS. Thanks.
Tandi, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just I mean, it's a really good and interesting point about media and the voices of people. Often, what we see in our research when we do analysis of the coverage of various issues and various topics is that voices of people, citizens' voices, are some of the least accessed voices in any area of of coverage. And we've seen that exactly with the most recent elections as well. I mean, I agree with many of your comments around accessing the voices of the people as you know, generally, and how the media tend to be obsessed with a political view, political narratives. Almost we function along the lines of celebrity politics, and we see that in a lot of ordinary coverage of issues as well. One of the recent findings that we saw, which was, you know, to me really concerning, is that organization Afrobarometer, they do surveys and they do research around numerous different issues. But one of the surveys that they did prior to elections was, what are some of the biggest issues that are important to ordinary people? And issues like water, load shedding and electricity, housing, crime and safety all came out in that survey, and they have their various methodologies and ways of gathering that data. But those were the issues that came out. And when we look at media coverage of that, well, when we looked at media coverage during elections, those topics barely featured anywhere close to some of the big issues that were being covered. So I think just to expand on that point as well, and just on the processes, policy and regulatory processes, and some of the, as Prof. Harbour says, some of the horrific pieces of draft legislation that we're seeing before the regulators and before Parliament, you know, it goes beyond just those drafts that need such intense panel beating to get them into, you know, just even to meet constitutional requirements. But it goes beyond that in terms of the approaches and the processes and attitudes that we see coming from parliamentary bodies, coming from portfolio committees, in that a lot of the so-called public participation of these processes seem to be tick box exercises to say, oh, we've consulted, we've gone through the processes, we have the drafts, you know, here it is. We need to be pushing for, and very deliberately so, pushing for the actual meaningful public participation processes in the very early stages of these drafts, because then we won't get to the point, or we shouldn't be getting to the point of presenting pieces of draft legislation to National Assembly that still will not pass constitutional tests, and we will save a lot of time and money.
Sandile, you want to go? But I'll go first on issues of particularly the gender, you know, the cyber-facilitated gender-based violence of female journalists. And I think, Prof, there's more we can do there. We are working with some of the advocacy groups, particularly the Step It Up campaign, which is led by the GIZ through a reference team. We participate in that. GIZ is a signatory to the Statement of Commitment, and as a result, we've partnered with them in offering training on gender-sensitive reporting to our own government reporters, to MDDA beneficiaries. We've also worked with the SABC around that. So that's kind of the small step that we've taken, but I do think there's more, particularly to do in that area. And we can definitely look at further bigger partnerships on this issue because it is growing. It is not decreasing. And I think if you look at doxing as an example, I think that then borders on like criminal issues again. So I do think that there's more that we can do around that, and we can engage further on that. But we are doing something around that. Sandy, you want to go on the legislative issues and public consultation, etc. With the MDDA bill coming up, maybe we can do better.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe to start, Prof, thanks for the questions. I mean, that's the kind of questions that we also need. But we're not going to touch on the issues of the separation of powers, because I think the portfolio committee is quite different. It's a different arm of the state So we are government. So, but I think what we'll do is that we'll note what we have raised. But maybe we'll start with the institutional arrangement that Dimitri raised. I think one of the challenges which we all accept is that it takes forever almost to develop a policy and a legislation. Similarly, to dissolve a legislation, and the example that you gave, which is fine in terms of the institutional arrangement. Right now, the process is about trying to develop a state infrastructure company. So you are dissolving Centec, Broadband Infraco, and CETA. But because most of these institutions are creature of statute, you need to go back to Parliament to ask for the dissolution so that we can come up. So there's a whole lot of a process that is involved that it can certainly take up to 5 years. And by the time you're even done with that process, there are other challenges that you need to quickly be dealing with. The same thing that, I mean, you're speaking around the issue of us having monopolies, whether it be free to air. I mean, if you look at the almost a commercial free to air in the form of SABC, in fact, in the form of ETV. Most people sometimes confuse ETV as a competitor to a public broadcaster, which is not. It's not. We are right that we haven't been able to license a free to air commercial broadcaster to compete with ETV. But the broader question is, I mean, with the lack of long-term sustainability that we're picking up in the sector, should we really be debating about the number of media outlets, or we should be coming together both in terms of the regulators, Competition Commission ourselves, the NGOs, as well as ICASA, and say, look, how do we regulate and how do we ensure that we don't regulate for failure? Because we can have a number of outlets which are not going to be sustainable. Maybe the proposal that we can have is that let's have a media diversity index, which is agreed to by all South Africans. At what point would we say we've got such a diverse media in this country, both print, digital, the so-called broadcasting as well? I'm saying so-called because you know that the term and how we define broadcasting in terms of being licensed and the usage of radio frequency spectrum is changing. Hence now we are talking about the audiovisual white paper as well. But I think we need to come to some sort of an agreement to say at this, because most countries which have done that have agreed that maybe the different distinction is about content diversity, which all the panel members are talking about. How do we ensure that everybody has a voice so that we don't run the risk of trying to create media outlets that are going to create a buying mood? That like scandals, because people are going to buy, people are going to view, the eyeballs are going to be there for them to sell adverts. So that's the issue that we really need to be focusing on. But I accept, even with the audiovisual white paper, it was a chapter, as you know, you were involved with us. It was a chapter in the 2016 ICT integrated white paper, which started actually in 2012. Because at that time we had, whether it was e-commerce white paper, the white paper on broadcasting, telecommunications, they were just old. And they were not fit for purpose, and then we need to fix that one. Prof, I think maybe part of what we need to do as GCIS as well is to talk about the things that we do more than what we are trying to do to empower citizens. If you were to go back to the founding principles of GCIS, which is found in the Comtas report, there's a provision that says that GCIS is meant to protect and preserve journalism. So in doing so, we are quite aware that there are a few issues that we need to work on. But at the same time, we do need to say to the question about, we've also created our own national newspaper called Vuvuzenzela. It's one of the newspapers that is printed in all languages, including Braille. And then there was also another question to say, how then do we communicate? We go to the citizens, we've got development communication, whether it would be at a local or district level, that's where we do. Because We can all sit here, colleagues. Many of the South Africans are still reliant heavily on the word of mouth because some of our outlets don't even reach the far-flung areas, and that's the reality. The other thing is that it's easy to jump and say, but you know what, there's ICT, we are ranked #1 in terms of the digital network in South Africa, but the cost to communicate is still. We still have infrastructure issues in other areas. We still have a very low levels of smartphone or smart gadget penetration in those areas. And the price, of course, to communicate the data. Now, somebody must choose between saving the 350 that they get or using it to buy data. That's the reality that we sit with. But I think we take the point. One other thing that we've also done is that we have a new entity called the Marketing, Advertising and Communication Sector Council. In it as well, there's a provision around encouraging advertisers in the private sector to ensure that at least when we portray women and youth, we are mindful, so it's under the provision called responsible marketing, so that in our totality we fight most of the things that are anti the development of what we are trying to do. But I think we'll take the point around how do we become actively involved, because we did try. I think there was a national liquor policy by the TTIC. We were one of the few that opposed it. Secondly, we also then did quite a bit around the Copyright Amendment Bill on our own. But I think what we now need, and which we have recognized, is that because we are a communications department whose critical function is a support function, but we do have a sector as well. So we'll ensure that when we have these engagements, sectors are brought on so that we have our own position paper in the different amendment bills and some of the policies that would oppose, because we will be talking about the need to harmonize some of the elements which are anti-progressive in our view. Thanks.
Letabo, you want to respond to Dimitri? Yes.
So the MDDA Act requires us to support small commercial media. The challenge is that the kind of support envisaged in the Act is that the MDDA is supposed to issue low interest bearing loans to small commercial media, which is a challenge for us because we are not a financial institution. And then part of what the work that we do is we're supposed to then facilitate these low interest loans for small commercial media. The challenge there is the viability of these organizations in terms of profit making and their ability to then pay for these loans. But through the EDF fund, we've managed to support quite a number of organizations. One guy comes to mind is Surprise from Soshanguve, Touch Media, who's playing into the outdoor digital advertising space. And through the EDF, we were able to support him, and also through support of our other stakeholders, the NYDA, we were able to assist him. We do give also grants to small commercial publishers. Unfortunately, we are unable to assist small commercial players in the broadcasting space because of legislation. Broadcasting is still envisaged, as Sandile explained, as having frequency and a license, etc. And so we are hoping that then the finalization of the white paper and amendment to the bill would see us supporting other platforms like online TV and podcasts.
We'd like to take another round of questions. Do we have any follow-ups, new questions? Yes, you may go ahead.
Good day, everyone. Right. My name is Mawatu. I'm from Communications. I'm concerned about the decline in the news, like what is of public interest and interesting to the public. There is a huge decline in that regard. And I think one of the reasons is that there's a green light. I attended a course by Media Monitoring Africa on reporting on children in the media. And we were taught about media law. And when we were having these discussions, we realized that most people do not want to get into reporting on children because you have to protect children. There's a lot of law behind that. So now what do we do as the media to ensure that these stories are told without us being scared to tell these stories?
Thank you. I think it's a very important question. Do you have any additional question? Okay, none. You want to take that, Tandy?
Yeah, I mean, it's. Thank you for that, the comment, and you know, reporting on children has been an area of working with media and reporting on children has been an area of MMA's work for just over 20 years, and it is a really difficult area because not only are there laws that you need to be able to understand and grapple with, but it comes down to ethical reporting on children. We spoke about ethics a little bit earlier, but you know, protecting or violating children's rights, it's a massive responsibility, and I think it is something that journalists often do struggle with, but it's one of the most important areas of media and journalism. If we talk about people's voices, one of the most marginalized areas of voice comes in when we're talking about children. So, you know, how you do that confidently, I think you take the first step by capacitating and skills development, like you have in terms of going on courses and understanding these issues and being confident in knowing where the boundaries are and what those, because those kind of barriers shouldn't be a hindrance to reporting on children. We've seen some fantastic reporting on children as well. Really not great reporting on children, but we've seen some really, really good areas. I mean, MMA runs an annual sort of competition called the Isu Elite Awards, currently in almost in the final stages at the moment, where it's a regional kind of awards, a regional competition where we support and recognize ideas around stories on children on the continent, and then the prize winners get awarded money to actually be able to produce those stories and publish those stories, because it's so important to be able to get this sort of content out there. And I think the fact that you are, you know, interested and passionate about this area is a really positive first step. But it's, you know, it's how are you brave enough? I think it's not only children and reporting on children that this is a problem. I think we've seen this as a sort of underlying hindrance to self-censorship and media freedom generally, because it's those really hard topics and those areas where journalists have to kind of step up and be brave, as you put it, to report. We've seen we've seen how the impact of those targeting journalists, often online attacks, the issue of harassment of journalists has come up a few times in the discussion. And journalism, it's a tough industry. It's we had a session yesterday around mental health and journalism, and it's really you know, something that doesn't get unpacked and spoken about a lot. MMA has recently launched a platform called MARS, Media Attack Reporting System, which looks at creating an evidence-based approach to dealing with those who are targeting and attacking journalists. So I think you've raised some really important issues that are part of a much broader discussion about empowering journalists to do the brave work that needs to be done.
I saw, Prof, you wanted to come in because you've been pushing the whole narrative of plurality of voices. So go ahead.
Yes, no, but I wanted this time around, I wanted to I think actually Tandy has covered me, because one of the points that one of the meetings I was attending before I came here was on the training of journalists and the the role of collaborating. We're talking about how do we collaborate with the law faculty, for instance, to ensure that the coverage of the most vulnerable section of our society, there is that adequate training. So I think Thandi has covered that very well. I mean, there's been quite a number of stories in the recent past about children, and how do you report on that? And how do you ensure that their voice, to an extent, is heard and they are properly represented is very important.
Sure. Yeah, just to add from what Tan was saying, that capacity building is quite important. And I think that's why for us as well as an organization, we strive to make the non-financial support aspect of the work that we do as sexy as the financial support work, because I think a lot of organizations that come to us lean towards the financial support, and for obvious reasons. They struggle with resources, financial, human resources, etc. And I think the fight for survival for them then makes the decision on their behalf, in that do you publish or broadcast in the public interest or what is interesting, and this perpetual fight for survival is the reason that a lot of community media organizations aren't able to, for example, pursue investigative journalism, pursue stories around protecting the rights and interests of children. And what the Prof is saying as well is that that's where collaboration becomes more important. We work with a number of organizations, MMA included, the FPB and the MISA, just to find ways we can capacitate the sector on content generation, but various thematic areas around content generation, so that they become a professionalized sector. Largely also important because a lot of the people that work in these organizations, most of them don't have post-matric qualifications or don't have qualifications in journalism. So you then also have to train them on the basic principles of news gathering and ethics, which becomes a challenge for us as well, given the resource constraints that we face. And this is where then the collaboration comes in.
Thank you. I think we can now answer the last question. Where to from here? What does the future hold now that we're in the 30 years of media freedom? And I'll start with Thandi.
I think, it's not a question that can be answered in one line, but I'm going to try and pull together some thoughts. But where to from now? We need to finalize and get ahead of this regulatory sort of process that we are still so far behind. We need to, reshape our thinking into looking at the sort of media environment to rather, think about an information ecosystem where it's not just traditional media models and traditional modes of media and communication that we working with. We working with, an entirely different changing information ecosystem that needs a multi-stakeholder approach to regulation. And, I'm going to capitalize off the opportunity to talk about the session this afternoon where at 2 o'clock we're going to be looking at the concept of an online integrity ombudsman, where it's sort of an approach to looking at how to deal with some of the issues that we're seeing online in terms of disinformation and online harm. So, we're at a point where, yes, there've been a lot of wins, wins that haven't been won without a struggle. And I think that, we do need to celebrate those wins, however hard it was to get there. I think South Africa is still comparatively, even when we sort of look at the region and we look at the continent and many other places globally, South Africa still does very well in terms of levels of press freedom, levels of freedom of expression, and we need to uphold that. And again, we're at an opportune moment to redefine how we approach these models of regulation. And yeah, I think if there's anything that, to be left with that, it's the need for multi-stakeholder approaches to solving these very complicated problems that not many people have solved yet. And I think for regulatory bodies to stay in their legalized, their mandate in terms of who is overreaching on various issues.
Let's have 30 years after. Where are we going with the community media sector?
I mean, I'm hoping that we continue to have a vibrant and sustainable community media sector, a community media sector that continuously strives for digitization and ensuring that it broadcasts and publishes in the interest of the communities that they serve. I think we also need to strike a balance between the demanding challenges, opportunities of digitization, and also just ensuring that we safeguard journalistic independence. But yeah, I think from here forward, I think it can only get better. And as Tandia is saying, finalization of the white paper and finalization of the amendment bill, Sandile.
Prof.
I think for me, there are 3 points I want to emphasize as the way forward. I think we are in a situation where there is an obvious migration to digital platforms. And I think that it's important that as this migration happens, and it should not replicate the current media concentration and reproduce the power asymmetries that we see in the current media setup. That is very important for me. And it requires some form of activism for that to happen. The second point is that as this migration to digital platform happens, there must be a clear and overt efforts to ensure that there is a regulation of digital platforms who are obviously undercutting the commercial media in South Africa. But obviously that will require some coming together. I mean, for example, one of the biggest problems is that if you look at South Africa as a market, it's a tiny market. So you need a South African Union to come together to ensure that there is some form of speaking in one voice in ensuring that we push back against the role of digital platforms that are unregulated in our context, because if that is allowed to happen, then the media as we know it will die. And the last point speaks to that, because if there's legal organization to that, then the proliferation of disinformation, misinformation will continue. And sooner rather than later, me and you will not know what is the truth and what is not the truth in the situation that we find ourselves. So one of my arguments I make is that in the past elections, time will tell, but I think that the disinformation and misinformation played a critical role in confusing quite a number of people towards the elections. And can we imagine, with the development of artificial intelligence, very soon we will not know what is the truth. So it is very important that we regulate these platforms.
Sandile?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for us, it's very important that we work together to navigate this space, because we're in the attention economy. And in this attention economy, content is everywhere, whether it's desirable or not. The other thing that we would also want to see happening, obviously, is maybe an increase in the children's content, because if you look at the content that we develop and produce for children's per capita, it's very shocking. And then colleagues have made an example on that. The one other element that would also have to take us forward, obviously in terms of we'll finalize the MDD amendment bill, which will also then define what the entity would look like in future when they now are even able to fund and support podcasting or any other content distributing platform of the future. And then, of course, then we do have, and I'm not going to spend, but there's a comment that was made by Prof. Dimitri will know that, in 2002, a decision was taken just to ensure that there's integration on the continent, which is something that we hardly talk about. So there was a decision taken on the Pan-African TV channel. That was 2002. Prof, where are we now? We don't have that channel. So when we are talking about regional integration, we need to be able to be very decisive about implementation of the decision that we've taken. So that when we fight these global OTT platforms, we fight it as a unit, because that's how, if you look at the Europe, that's how they've been able to do it, because you are unable to fight that on your own. And then lastly for us, I think it would also be the issue of maintaining the things that are well, for instance, the protection of children against consumption of harmful media content. So the role of APB is also going to be pronounced. The role of GCIS going forward would also be, because we need to redefine ourselves and say, how do we become an authentic center for authentic government information in the space where we will be in? Thanks.
Thank you so much to all of you.